Alright, brace yourself. This is going to be a video that assumes Andrew is canon to the FNaF games. But don't worry, we're going to do some cool stuff with it, and if it's ever proven he's solidly not in the world of the games with later material, then yeah, we can just walk back to the old ideas. There is no harm in talking about this. Now, I know a lot of people's knee-jerk reaction is going to be saying, hey, he was just proven to not exist in the game worlds via Return to the Pit. I'll get to that in a moment, just allow me to recap the general existence of Andrew for people who are not as familiar, because he is a book character. Book characters are not as known as game characters. The short summary of Andrew is he is an extra victim of William Afton, who at the time of his introduction was not really explained where he came from, but at some point he latched onto Afton's soul, and after a big fire, was able to torture Afton in an endless nightmare scenario. Eventually Afton's body is found by the Heracles Hospital, and Afton is able to trick a priest coming by to bring him to a Fazbear distribution center. Once in the distribution center, Afton's body explodes, shattering Afton and Andrew's soul across all the stuff inside of the distribution center. One way or another, everything in there finds its way into circulation, though it's not exactly clear how, because Fazbear should be shut down by this point, but it also seems to have made a comeback by this point.
Well, let's not dwell on that too much and just focus on the haunted stuff.
For example, Fetch, the title character of the short story book Fetch, is one of the things Andrew had infected, and it goes through its own short story tormenting a kid with a phone and all that, but after the events of that short story, Fetch slowly breaks down and finds its way into the collection of a scientist who studies paranormal activity named Phineas Taggart. Phineas is obsessed with human emotions and how that can have supernatural properties, dubbing the most powerful emotion agony, as in literal human suffering made manifest. Now, it's worth noting Phineas's research isn't exactly 100% correct. We later see that love is just as powerful but harder to draw out than agony, which makes sense. It's harder to artificially love someone, but it's really easy to induce agony into stuff. But the point is, he is obsessed with haunted stuff. And one of the other things he collected was a doll haunted by a cancer victim named Jake. Phineas tries to assemble a new endoskeleton powered by the various haunted materials, including with the mask from Jake's doll, as well as the battery from Fetch, creating what we will know as in the future, the Stitch Wraith. However, there is a caveat to all of the things Andrew and Afton haunt. Between Andrew's hate of Afton, Afton's violent and evil tendencies, everything they haunt is sort of violent or destructive in one way or another, though the personalities and attributes between them is different each time, with Andrew having pretty much no control over how they behave. In this case, even though Jake usually controls the Stitch Wraith, when it comes into contact with Phineas Taggart, it immediately kills him. Over the course of the stingers, Jake and Andrew will try to collect all the things Andrew haunted, because they are violent and dangerous, eventually encountering the sort of final boss of the agony-infected things, Eleanor, as well as defeating Afton along the way, freeing Andrew's soul, yada yada yada. That was the gist of his character. Now, obviously with Andrew tormenting Afton after the events of a fire, there is a lot of obvious connections with Ultimate Custom Night, and that's sort of where the contention has been with this character this whole time. Is Andrew the vengeful spirit from Ultimate Custom Night, or is he an alternate timelines version of the character? Or in some cases, is he another spirit tormenting Afton, and is the vengeful spirit a different character than him? There are a lot of variations on this topic. Now, one of the implied origins he could have had was as being the sixth kid seen in Into the Pit's original short story, alongside the other 5 main kids who possess the original characters we all know. And in the game version of Into the Pit, this happened again. Once again, there were 6 total kids Pit Trap shows to Oswald. However, in the latest incarnation of Into the Pit, the Choose Your Own Adventure book Return to the Pit, there are only 5 dead kids now in the incident, just like there had always been in the older FNaF games, and movie, and novels, which led a lot of people to say, hey, those other versions must just not be canon or something. Andrew is only part of those alternate timelines where there are 6 kids, not our main timeline where there are 5 kids. But that's not really how Return to the Pit handles it. I mean, it is, but it isn't. Both in the original FNaF games and this short story book, it has always been represented as there being 5 kids killed on one day. There is one FNaF poster that says 2 kids were seen on camera, and some people have taken that to mean that 2 kids were killed, then 3 kids were killed or something like that, but that is not what those 2 posters actually say. What those posters really say is that 2 kids were seen on camera, then later the police discovered there was a total of 5 kids missing. It is referred to as the singular incident. This is how it's represented in Foxy Go Go Go, and also every other representation of the MCI after this point. It is always 5 kids lured to one room, then killed. Except for the game, short story, and graphic novel version of Into the Pit, where it is 6 kids. However, Return to the Pit updates this detail by having 5 kids be in the safe room, just like it's always been in the games. But there's also one more. See, while the 5 kids we've always known about are in the safe room on a later day in Return to the Pit, if you go from basically the moment you can get to that back room, as soon as possible, as soon as the book allows you to go, you find only 1 kid in that back room, 2 days days prior to when you'll find the other missing kids. And the book will repeatedly show that it's all 5 kids killed together. They are not lured across multiple days. So that raises the question, who is this kid? You could say maybe it's Charlie. And while in the original short story, I think you could argue the pit is just weird and magical and changes details, and even Return to the Pit kind of is weird and magical, it doesn't change the relevant detail. The 5 missing kids are still killed in the safe room in Return to the Pit. So why would Charlie, who died outside of the building to normal William, who was not in costume, die in the safe room or a back room? Even if you simplify the pit down to it represents memories weird, that's just not how her memory played out. And she's also not present in this book at all elsewhere. Like, there's no puppet anywhere else, which is just a running detail of Into the Pit in the first place that I still don't quite understand to this date, but that's a whole other topic. And I can't just say Return to the Pit isn't canon, therefore it doesn't matter, it doesn't connect to anything. Because A, all the other Choose Your Own Adventure books seem to tie into canon really well, or at least prove they use game characters very accurately, including details not normally present in the short stories. But B, as weird as the rest of the book is, there's not a lot that implies it can't exist in the game world. But the point this is getting to is there is one extra kid in this short story who is not accounted for. And if they were killed by a representation of William, even if it's a monster memory version, then that would have to be one extra victim killed by Spring Bonnie, William in costume, in a back room 2 days prior to the missing children's incident. And I know this won't be a popular claim, especially on YouTube, but without introducing an entirely other character or retconning another character's backstory, there's only really one kid who could fit into the game continuity in the context of Fazbear Fright and Return to the Pit. This freeloading prick. But I think we can actually get a lot closer to piecing together how Andrew was meant to fit into the game continuity, because there is some interesting clues here. What is stated about Andrew in Fazbear Frights? He was killed by William, obviously, and he seems to like Freddy's or thinks the stuff from Freddy's is at the very least cool, because when he's telling Jake about the Fazbear Distribution Center seen in Man in Room 1280, he describes it as filled with lots of cool stuff. If he was specifically called out as not liking any of the animatronics ever, that would obviously poke a hole in the whole connection of him being there or not. So as far as we know, it checks out that he would be a kid at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. But what's a little bit more interesting is that Andrew doesn't recall at all ever having friends. Now granted, after he and Afton's souls are blown up in the whole distribution center thing, he seems to have some amnesia of who he was and exactly what happened with Afton. But I don't think it's him forgetting anything, because it's played completely definitively. I haven't had friends in a very long time. It's not a statement made with room for doubt. In fact, he gets very defensive when Jake questions him about it. It's not written as something that he's unsure of about himself. It's an intended insecurity in his personality. But as we'll see with Jake, he is able to make friends and connections, even if he's not sure how exactly. And given that Charlie's entire character was helping people, I want to save those who have been left behind, and I see no way for her to have a connection to the missing kids, but not Andrew if they've been in the same pizzeria the whole time. Unless you're telling me Jake is such a holy saint that only he can befriend Andrew, and that he was so unlikable that the missing kids and Charlie just left him behind and abandoned him, I don't see how he could have had a connection with the other kids and the story still make any sense in that context. Andrew isn't meant to be some irredeemable, unfeeling, completely hate-based being of no redeemable qualities. He is meant to be another scared and frustrated kid who does want to be helped and saved at the end of the day. He just is having a bit more trouble than maybe the other kids might have. And given that he's friends with Jake by the end of their first encounter and is outright afraid of Jake leaving him behind later on, and that was definitely less than 30 years between point A and B, I just don't see how he could be this unfeeling monster he would need to be for the other kids to leave him behind. Which I know is how some people are going to argue that line works. I haven't had friends in a long time, but I knew other spirits or something like that. No, the other kids could have easily befriended him. Which in a weird way actually does help us try to decipher what happened with Andrew. Because if he doesn't know the missing kids but died in the same place as them, then there had to be some special factors or circumstances with him that prevented him from connecting with the other kids. He can't possess anything in the base pizzeria that they would have time to interact with across their 30 years. He can't share a suit with another kid in Golden Duo style for that same reason. And also, if he was just some roaming ghost, which is a concept the short stories play with, once again, he should be known by the other kids. We see their spirits walking around and Follow Me, but there's only 5 of them. Either this 5th kid is now retroactively Andrew, and Cassidy / the original 5th kid just isn't here at all, or there is something preventing him from appearing in Follow Me as a roaming spirit. And maybe you could argue he doesn't appear in Follow Me because it was just written before before his introduction or concept, but between the week before and just anything else made after FNaF 3, we still haven't seen any indication of him just being a spirit that just floated around the pizzeria the whole time. And usually FNaF, when it retcons something into existence, he's decently good at saying how it wasn't seen prior. Like, arguably, Spring Bonnie is a retcon in that he is not a concept presented in FNaF 1 or 2, and thus changes the context of FNaF 1's posters. But FNaF 3 does a good job explaining why he wouldn't have been talked about there, thus not really making him function like a retcon by normal definition. The puppet is very similar. FNaF 3 shows that the puppet just isn't around by the events of Follow Me for whatever reason. It at some point had left. Even the Mimic is an abandoned project from an independent guy who isn't part of the main Fazbear brand for most of its history, explaining why we didn't randomly see it anywhere else. So I really don't think the whole "he wasn't created yet" completely justifies why no later material showed him there, and why his existence in said material he was introduced in did not come with an explanation like everything else did. Unless it did come with an explanation, even if the original short stories explain so very, very poorly. Let's consider this. Andrew was killed in the back room, or more accurately, the safe room. But for whatever reason, 2 days later, his body isn't there anymore, meaning either he was stuffed or disposed of in that 2-day span. And assuming Afton didn't drag his body out in public in front of everyone, that would in turn imply that Afton either waited a decent amount of time for the pizzeria to close down and clear up, or he stuffed him, and both roads lead to Rome here. In this series, you do not need to literally be stuffed in something to haunt it. Charlie haunts the puppet without literally being stuffed in it. Jake haunts his doll without literally being inside of it. So if Andrew is in the back room, or more accurately, the safe room, and there are 2 animatronics permanently banned who are always in that safe room, and there's a reasonable chance that being around them for several hours would have caused him to haunt one of those 2 things, which would be either Fredbear or Spring Bonnie. Well, I guess he could technically be Fredbear. Spring Bonnie has a lot more evidence. Firstly, Andrew needs some way to get to FNaF 6's fire, and if he's in the game continuity, then obviously that narrative has to be consistent with the evidence present already in the game. We can't just say, oh, there was Springlock Monty retroactively in the FNaF 6 fire, because that was not shown to us and not even clarified in later material. And there is no moment in Fazbear Frights or FNaF 6 or any materials currently released that ever shows us that Andrew was stumbled upon by William in some later game, like Springtrap just fell into Freddy's and once again, Springlock Monty was there and Andrew hopped onto him from there. Which would have to mean either Spring Bonnie / the Springtrap costume, Molten Freddy, Lefty, or Scrap Baby had Andrew's soul in it. Since Scrap Baby seems to universally talk or act like she's Elizabeth, we're going to kind of cross her off the list. Then once again would boil down to either Lefty, Molten Freddy, or Springtrap. And once again, it doesn't make sense for it to be Molten Freddy or Lefty, because Andrew does not remember having friends. If he was part of a molten metal monster bear for years, he would probably remember the other kids existing, so once again that doesn't make sense, and neither does Lefty, because I doubt Charlie would just let a kid suffer and leave him behind. And also when we do see the puppet in the Fazbear Fight Stingers, she doesn't ever acknowledge Andrew, she just goes straight for killing Afton, then bails. If that's even Charlie still being sentient or just remaining power left in the mask. That leaves, by process of elimination, Spring Bonnie. But we can get much more specific than that. The main OST theme of Ultimate Custom Night is Aistrophobia, the fear of mirrors. While in the past this theme was correlated to Golden Freddy / Fredbear to show that Spring Bonnie's mirror costume, its twin co-star, was its mirror, it literally being Afton's reflection, the soul that haunts its own costume, would add a lot more weight to that connection. And also, if Golden Duo is ever confirmed, it would mean that the Springlock suits, the 2-in-1 costumes with 2 different modes, both have 2 souls in them each, which would be kind of just funny, and a cool kind of narrative parallel, especially if 2 of the spirits get along and work together and the other 2 spirits hate each other. But more importantly, it would play on older lore to explain why Andrew doesn't know about the other kids, and why none of them could even help him or know about him in the first place. Animatronics are not allowed in the safe room, so all of the core 4 kids, they could never go back there. Charlie was not in the FNaF 1 location for whatever reason. Maybe she was in the past in the 1985 version of the location, but for whatever reason after that point, she is no longer back there. But more importantly, Spring Bonnie has been in costume mode this whole time seemingly, can see it with its blank eyes slumped over like a costume. And while Golden Freddy seems to be some exception to this rule, usually when an animatronic's AI is deactivated or something like that's at play, they can't do anything even if they're haunted. If you turn off their AIs in the custom night modes, which FNaF 1 and 2's custom nights are canon, those are literally happening, you are literally tampering with their settings, you get fired for it after doing this, they cannot move, other than Foxy and the puppet, who even in FNaF 1, Foxy can be shut down. So if Spring Bonnie's current programming is you cannot move, you are in costume mode, Andrew would be stuck there the whole time, unable to move, unable to leave, unable to do anything. Hell, with Afton's existence, it's implied that even animatronic mode can't leave the safe room because Afton doesn't leave the safe room despite being there for like 30 years. So even if he was an animatronic, I'm not sure he could do anything, but the costume mode also adds to another point. What is one of the other soundtracks in Ultimate Custom Night? Hibernating Evil. Now obviously that refers to Afton dreaming and suffering forever, as we see in the Man Room 1280. This is one never-ending nightmare he can't wake from.
Now let's say, for the sake of argument, that you are Andrew. You're this kid who thinks Freddy Fazbear's Pizza is pretty cool, like most kids your age. That said, you don't actually get along with most kids your age. Maybe you do have some friends at this point in time, but you're a bit brash and a bit hard to get used to, so you're not good at making them. Then this new character, this one you haven't maybe seen in a while, if ever appeared, this Spring Bonnie guy. And you know, you're not that much of a goody two-shoes, you kind of like breaking rules here and there. You like pranks, you like messing with people, and he tells you about this cool place at the back of the pizzeria. So you follow him back there to see what he has in store for you, what special surprise is just there for you. And in those brief moments that you're both back there, and that's that.
Now imagine, for example, you cannot see because your eyes are deactivated. You cannot move because your limbs are deactivated. You are haunting an old animatronic rabbit that is completely decommissioned and that no one can interact with.
For the next several years, more years than the years you've been alive as a kid, as a person, you are stuck reliving your life up to that point, or perhaps even just that day. It's all you have to think about because you are now just this suit, this husk, a husk that he uses to kill more people, but you might not even remember that because you were just this dormant shell, locked and decommissioned in this back room for ages. You can't experience anything new. All you can do is relive everything you've done up to this point, and that always ends with you dying. You can't find anything to be happy about anymore because you know where it all goes. Would that not be like a never-ending nightmare? And then suddenly, after all of these years, you're shocked back to life with the guy who killed you now being permanently fused with you. And then you're just stuck with him for 20, 30, however many years. And then he escapes and tries to go killing and hurting people again. If there was any origin story for someone to call themselves the one you should not have killed, I think it would be something like that. Maybe he could understand that other kids had been killed by this guy by some point, though I don't think he ever states that in Fazbear Frights. But it's all beside the point from his view. He only knows his own story, his own suffering, that loneliness for that long. He couldn't even imagine that other kids could have gone through what he did, or at least something similar. And remember how Andrew describes his torment of Afton. I remember I wanted to make him suffer, the way he made me suffer. Andrew inflicted that exact same nightmare upon him forever. However, this time, Afton's at the mercy of everything he ever did. His own memories used to torment him forever. And you might wonder why I'm saying Afton's memories. Wouldn't it be the actual spirits of the other kids, or a scenario created entirely by Andrew? And while there might be some truth to the idea of Andrew creating it, I don't think it could actually be the other kids. At least if their goal was to move on. Maybe if the missing kids were willingly staying behind to help torment Afton, that could maybe make sense, even if it does contradict Andrew remembering him having friends or not. But if they were held against their will by Andrew, that kind of becomes a narrative plot hole, because I don't know how Andrew could stop Charlie from freeing the other kids, assuming that was her goal. Charlie was able to take down the giant Afton trash amalgam mixed with Eleanor, or at least the remnant of power in her mask or whatever it was did. And you're telling me she couldn't stop Andrew from tormenting Afton and holding 4 or 5 or however many other souls in that nightmare scenario? Like, you're telling me that none of them could do anything about it against Andrew, despite the series showing that the missing kids could overpower Elizabeth in a prior game, ejecting her from the amalgam of Ennard and creating Golden Freddy and Scrap Baby as separate beings? Meanwhile, Andrew, regardless of what theory you want to argue, was in FNAF 6 for the same time as Afton for a good while, and couldn't torment him until after the fire. And Charlie basically nuked him with Eleanor boosting him. So if she was aware of Ultimate Custom Night, she could have easily stopped it, which would either mean she doesn't want it to stop, which is weird considering that she says she doesn't give a shit about Afton anymore in Ultimate Custom Night, and B, given her whole spirit guardian role, why would she let a angry, frustrated, lonely kid suffer just to make Afton suffer who she doesn't care about? I just can't believe that Charlie would let Andrew be in Ultimate Custom Night if she was aware of him and he was holding her friends hostage. Also, Andrew goes through the biggest power nerf in the series if that's the case. He goes from not being able to stop Afton to being able to completely control like 5, 6, 7 other spirits in Ultimate Custom Night. I don't know, maybe they're all weak from the fire, but that's just insane power creep just for him to go back to not being able to do anything again. However, there is a consistent mechanic in this series that would explain how this works, because memories are a constant motif of both Fazbear Frights and the general FNAF universe, especially in the context of dreams. The survival logbook. Cassidy's able to recall what happened to the bite victim. The party was for you. It was for me. Does he still talk to you? Implying Cassidy somehow knows about psychic friend Fredbear. And then there's the whole movie where the missing kids are able to manipulate Mike's dream memory of what happened to Garrett. And then you have the entire goddamn ball pit, which is a living replay loop of various memories of crimes committed by William in the history of Fazbear Entertainment, and everything that it reached out and infected. So I think it makes more sense to be Afton's own memories of these characters and concepts used against him. In other words, the Charlie we hear talking in Ultimate Custom Night is William's memory of how Charlie was, not literally Charlie in Ultimate Custom Night for some goddamn reason. For a man as cruel and psychotic as William, what better way to torment him than what he did to everyone else coming back to bite him? Now, also consider one of the lines the Vengeful Spirit has.
He tried to release you. He tried to release us. But I'm not gonna let that happen. I will hold you here. I will keep you here. No matter how many times they burn us.
Now, in the early days of Molten MCI Alter Est, I used this idea to support the idea that the spirit of Golden Freddy was in Fazbear's Fright, but if you were to assume that Andrew had been haunting Spring Bonnie this whole time, that might explain how that line would click. Andrew and Afton had literally been burned multiple times. And with a bit of a crude segue, I want to talk about Spring Bonnie's design change between Springtrap and Scraptrap, or more accurately, the actual internals of the costume. Because, interestingly, Scraptrap has almost no metal endoskeleton visible in his design anymore. It's almost all gore and bone. And we know from Dogco that there was a lore reason Springtrap looked so different between 3 and 6. And that raises the question, why so much of the endoskeleton? Well, on some level it makes sense that Afton would try to remove components from Spring Bonnie, but you would think that Afton, who understands Remnant at this point, would want to keep as much metal in his suit as possible, mainly because it should be the ultimate failsafe in case his body fully gives out. And yes, somehow Afton is still alive. Has a heartbeat, and he's the only FNAF 6 animatronic to have a heartbeat. You can barely hear it in the salvage minigame. It does not play in any other interaction, and he's described as alive by the Heracles Hospital just barely, which itself implies that there is some supernatural force keeping him alive, and I think that same supernatural force is what he was trying to get rid of. From Afton's point of view, metal is what's haunted in animatronics, so it would make sense from his perspective to try and remove Andrew by ripping out the endoskeleton. Even if he is more powerful than Andrew because his body's still alive and he obviously still controls it that way, I doubt Andrew was making his life easy, so he tried to get rid of him. However, at this point, I don't think it was possible to do that anymore. Andrew stated he got into his soul, that he wouldn't let go. So while he may not yet have been strong enough to hold down Afton into something like Ultimate Custom Night, he still clung on until the fire, making Afton weak enough to be tormented. And I haven't even gotten to the strongest evidence yet, which is Into the Pit's game version. Now, maybe Into the Pit's game version will be proven to be its own continuity or not part of the game continuity or something like that, which would be really confusing because it's the game version of a short story. You would think if any of them were big canon to the games, it would be the one that's an actual goddamn game, but for the sake of argument, let's just say it is. The Pit Keeper has dialogue lines in this game. Here are 2 of them. I obviously a reference to Afton. Here's the other dialogue line. Now note, this isn't fan subtitling, this is what they're labeled in the game files. And it's really weird that the Pit Keeper specifically references a line from Afton and a line from Andrew. The Pit Keeper, the distorted memory world version of Spring Bonnie, from the Ball Pit that Andrew and Afton's souls specifically link back to for some reason, or at least all the things they haunt do. That Ball Pit. To me, that was the first tip-off that there might be some connection between the two, and then it kept going. Not only with the rest of the video I presented up to this point, but if you think about the one character of the Legacy cast who has ever interacted with Andrew, or at least seems to be aware of Andrew's existence even if they didn't directly interact themselves. The only original animatronic who should have ever been in the safe room. In Ultimate Custom Night, the final cutscene is Golden Freddy staring at the camera as it fades away and twitches. Now, while that was commonly assumed to be Golden Freddy tormenting Afton and never resting because of that, it also could be Golden Freddy watching Afton be taken to the Heracles Hospital. And why I say that instead of Golden Freddy moving on is A, I stand by this is not what a spirit resting has ever looked like and is very antithetical to what it's supposed to look like, but also because we can hear the dying embers of the fire from FNaF 6 in the background of the Void OST that plays in this cutscene. It's very quiet, but if you turn up the volume, you can hear it. And if the idea was the fire was releasing all the souls burned by it, then its dying embers should mean that Golden Freddy wasn't burned if that's supposed to go along with this visual. Instead, I think this is more of a stinger, showing that A, Golden Freddy is still out there, and B, Afton is going somewhere else, far away from where Golden Freddy was. Not to mention, Golden Freddy will later appear in Into the Pit, specifically the game version where Golden Freddy is seen watching this kid interact with Fetch. Assuming this is the same Fetch haunted by Andrew, which we have no reason to doubt currently, that would mean Man in Room 1280 has already concluded, meaning this is very far after the fire. Once again, you could maybe brush that aside by saying, oh, the Into the Pit game version isn't canon for whatever reason. Return to the Pits is the only canon or something like that. Now, there's not a lot to validate that statement, but let's say that is the case. We still have one more appearance of Golden Freddy to account for. Obviously, you have this Ultimate Custom Night sequence, which is a reference to FNaF World, which in turn relates to Happiest Day, which is about Golden Freddy, and the Bite Victim, who can, no matter what you think he possesses or does, talk to the kid who haunts Golden Freddy, and or is part of Golden Freddy. Or if you think the Red Bear is Cassidy, then that's straight up Cassidy. I don't know what you want from me. And as we established earlier, Cassidy could do some weird stuff when it comes to the Bite Victim's memories, and movie Golden Freddy could also do weird stuff with memories, and also novel Golden Freddy could do weird stuff with memories. So if the Bite Victim ever learned about Andrew's existence anyway, Cassidy could in turn learn about Andrew from that, even if you don't buy the whole safe room connection. If anyone were to pick up on Andrew's existence, it would be Golden Freddy. And honestly, this just continues to make Golden Freddy this more and more interesting, confusing character. Now, I think for a lot of the older book debates from the past few years, a lot of people arguing for Andrew being the vengeful spirit, I think overcorrected the proposed alternate version of Cassidy for that timeline, in that a lot of the Cassidys I was seeing presented were basically Michael Brooks 2 gender-bent game version. Hell, my frustration with that concept is what sparked the idea for Cassidy fandom erasure, which I don't mostly agree with now, but I do stand by the sentiment that I think the overcorrection is, well, an overcorrection. In this case, it's not even entirely speculative, because Into the Pit's game version just straight up has Golden Freddy watch and let it happen. In Ultimate Custom Night, Golden Freddy is just straight up aware of what's going on and lets it happen. Which, you know, Michael Brooks wouldn't do. But also, obviously, if Andrew was the vengeful spirit, then that also means they wouldn't torment Afton themselves, or at least aren't doing it themselves. Which, you know, like I said, two different extremes, both of which might be overcorrections. A Cassidy made to facilitate the argument that Andrew has to be the vengeful spirit because Cassidy could not be in personality, and a Cassidy specifically made to be the vengeful spirit and account for that in the personality. But the actual Cassidy might just be a weird, spooky bastard. Because unlike the classic kids who Ultimate Custom Night gave an excuse for of, oh, they're like animals, they don't really know what they're doing, that kind of sentiment, Golden Freddy, or at least Cassidy, is portrayed as completely aware. The stuff Golden Freddy pulls off in the week before is elaborate, psychological, and honestly disturbing when you remember this is a kid willingly doing this. I'm curious if the later Fazbear Fright game adaptations will elaborate on Golden Freddy's role and appearance in this. It could be as simple as Cassidy doesn't want to move on until Andrew's moved on, or there might be a darker purpose behind this, considering that Golden Freddy doesn't seem to exactly be
helping? Because I mean, like, Golden Freddy is twitching real violently, and it's kind of weird to show this and mention this again if we weren't meant to think about it or question it, because this has nothing to do with Andrew really, other than saying, oh yeah, one of the kids knew about him but didn't care. It's sort of like handing someone a glass of water and saying, don't worry, it isn't poison. I already assumed it wasn't poison. Why would you mention that unless it was tampered with in some way? In this case, we already assumed Golden Freddy was done and gone. It was either burned in the fire, part Golden Freddy, moved on a happiest day. Pick A, B, C, or D, all the above. Showing Golden Freddy at the end this way, especially when it's a way that's opposite of how Golden Freddy was meant to move on the last time, is just confusing for the sake of confusing. Part of the reason I'm not entirely convinced Andrew is in the game continuity still, but if I were to have him in there, I think having this cutscene serve the purpose of showing Golden Freddy is still out there and Andrew and Afton are being taken away somewhere else. Makes more sense, as that actually does segue into Andrew's story a bit. It's saying, hey, this story isn't done yet. There's still something going to happen. Versus, it's over. Golden Freddy was here. Don't worry about it. Because you really could have just done that with the Old Man Consequences scene. But whatever. This is supposed to be an Andrew video. I'm getting off topic. I will say this video exists because I finally feel like I have an explanation for Andrew that hits the boxes I was looking for. I think for so long the discussion about Andrew was he in the game continuity or not? I don't think enough time in major discussion circles was taken to figure out how, the why, the what, just is or is not. It became about proving continuity errors and minutia details like that, and this at least gives an explanation for why his character exists the way he does. For years I had heard he was the abandoned and lost spirit, and I understood that on a technical level, but what frustrated me was why? How could you exist that way in this series unless you had such a repulsive personality that you had to be expelled? However, Andrew's personality just wasn't like that. As I said earlier in the video, Andrew is annoying, he is brash, it is hard for him to make friends, but it only took a little bit of time and effort and persistence for it to work. So if his story wasn't about him being so unlikable that he couldn't work with the other kids, there had to be some other reason at play. And when I heard Into the Pit Spring Bonnie's line, I started looking to that possibility. Sure, maybe it will be ultimately proven that the game continuity isn't the same as the Into the Pit game continuity, as confusing as that's going to be. But even if you take that away, the rest of the paper trail lines up. It actually works with prior mechanics rather than against them or in spite of them. That's one of the most frustrating things I see people talk about when they talk about the whole 6 MCI versus 5 MCI stuff. This allows for an additional victim at the original Freddy's and explains what's different enough to gel together. Similar to how I mentioned that Spring Bonnie is a retcon by traditional definition, but not by Scott's definition, Andrew is a similar factor. The way he would be added into the story under this timeline does not completely overwrite prior information, rather adds on to it. Rather than saying, oh, there were actually 6 kids in the MCI, it says there was an additional one before them, maybe like a prototype, a first draft, a first attempted murder by William to see whether he could pull this off or not, and then he went bigger with the other kids. Maybe because this was so early in his history of murders, the lack of activity bothered him and he wanted to recreate Charlie, so he continued to kill until it worked. And I like how that obsession William has pays back in Andrew's personality. It's one of the things I liked about him alright enough as it was without this theory. Hell, there are many things to like about Andrew. As annoying as he can be, the idea of a kid who is just so frustrated and obsessed that he wants people to understand what he went through but can't express it in any way other than anger and violence is compelling enough. There are people like that in the real world who have trouble making friends, and it's nice to see a timeline where he can find someone who understands what he's like, what he's really like, not just the aggro, frustrated part of him. That narrative plot beat is cool. My biggest gripe with Andrew still is that his resolution feels like, yeah, he took the initial steps writing-wise, but I would like if he paid back and helped Jake some in return more than he did. Like, I can still see Jake freeing him. I don't think that itself is the problem, though I think I would like it more if he freed himself. But I think it would be cool if somehow the puppet returning or something like that, something related to his agony, was what defeated Afton. Him deciding to move on was such a powerful reaction of emotion, finally shifted the tide of battle and forced Afton to lose. Rather, the puppet's inclusion feels a little bit like a kill steal. Like, we did all this effort to get up to this point and Charlie just happened to do it. I know it's poetic because she's the first victim and all that, so it is sort of cool that she does it in a grander sense, but in the context of the story, it feels a little out of nowhere and underdeveloped. And I could get into all the minutia, good parts and bad parts, Jake, Larson, Eleanor, but I'm kind of rambling a bit. Before I do end the video, I do want to list some random extra thoughts I just have written down. The big one I think a lot of people react to with this video is, oh, you didn't mention the alligator mask at all. But the problem is If Andrew is the vengeful spirit from Ultimate Custom Night, that's just a continuity error outright. He didn't have a mask in that game, why would he have one later? And secondly, there's no reason for him to haunt an alligator in any context. If he was killed at Freddy's, if that's our assumption from Return to the Pit, there wasn't one in Return to the Pit, there wasn't one in the original Into the Pit, there wasn't one in any of the short stories, unless you're talking about Monty Gator later down the road, and the only alligator we've seen in the correct, even vague time period, which was still too early in the form of 1979, was the one in the Secret of the Mimic trailer. And that's not at Freddy's, where he needs to be, at least if we're assuming he's the kid in Return to the Pit, and if he's not, then we don't have any proof of Andrew existing in the game continuity that is as solid as that outing. Well, maybe it could be one of the spare suits mentioned in FNaF 3. We don't see any of those suits anywhere enough to say, yep, Andrew was that, and that's how he got from point A to point B. Because that's the other aspect. It's not just enough for him to haunt an alligator, it has to be an alligator costume that ends up in FNAF 6's fire for him to meet Afton and torment him there. At least if we're going off the game continuity. If Fazbear Frights was its own continuity, sure, he could haunt an alligator exclusive to that continuity that just we never saw in the original context. And we're not talking about him in the context of Fazbear Frights on its own. We're talking about him in the context of the game universe. And in the game universe, I don't have proof of an alligator costume. If I were to try and think of an explanation, I would just say that he likes alligators, honestly. Like, it's his ghost body. He could just make a mask if he wanted. I mean, he did like pranks and scaring people. Maybe he just thought the nurse would be scared of an alligator. Like, maybe there is an explanation to it. I'm just waiting for it to happen. And one other thing that popped up while I was making this video was, in Dead by Daylight, there's this interesting line about Springtrap's bio where it says, something set off the spring lock failure, which is kind of funky wording, which makes me almost wonder if Andrew set off the spring lock failure? Like, if he was haunting Spring Bonnie, he could have forcefully triggered it even though Afton put it on correctly. I mean, Afton seems to be a master of using the suit, and in both the novels and movie, it was forcefully triggered. It was not a mistake. Maybe there's something to that?